Are you ready to hear what no one else dares to say? The truth is that the American empire is crumbling, and most people still live as if we're in a golden age. But we're not. And understanding this can change how you see the world, your finances, and even your political choices. In this video, you'll uncover the clear signs of America's decline, understand how it directly affects your life, and why the media would rather keep you in the dark. We'll talk about economics, wars, technology, labor, debt, geopolitics, all based on facts, data, and history. I'm Mr. Monny, economist, and here on this channel, we're committed to the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. If you value honest, direct, and evidence-based content, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to wake up. Let's begin. The decline of the American empire. For over a century, the United States was seen as the pinnacle of modern civilization, an economic, military, and cultural superpower. But that image no longer reflects reality. We are now living what historians call the downward phase of an empire. And the most dangerous part isn't the collapse itself, but the collective refusal to acknowledge it. Unlike past eras, such as post-Wabihuis or the industrial boom, today we see a deeply divided nation, economically unstable and geopolitically isolated. What once symbolized progress now signals stagnation. Empires don't fall in explosions, but through slow fractures, loss of military dominance, rise of rivals, internal institutional breakdown, chronic debt, growing inequality, and a population increasingly hopeless about the future. These signs are everywhere, yet ignored by leaders who would rather sell optimism than face reality. Historically, every declining empire goes through a phase of denial. Rome tried to maintain appearances while crumbling from within. The British Empire did the same in the 20th century. The US is now following the same script, clinging to a leadership role that much of the world has already begun to question. This institutional denial prevents the population from preparing, from adapting their economy, lifestyle, and expectations. And while the elite protects itself, the middle class and working people pay the price for the silence. But America's decline can no longer be hidden, especially when we observe its consequences on a global scale. And that brings us to the next essential point in this analysis: the military defeats that marked the visible beginning of this downfall. Lost wars and the end of military hegemony. If there's a moment when the world starts to perceive an empire's fragility, it's when it stops winning wars. For decades, U.S. military superiority seemed unquestionable. But over the last 50 years, that myth has quietly but relentlessly unraveled. The defeat in Vietnam in 1975 was the first major shock, a long, costly, and devastating conflict that ended with the U.S. being expelled by a much smaller and less equipped force. For years, that defeat was swept under the rug, hidden beneath nationalist speeches and political justifications. But it was only the beginning. Then came Afghanistan, the longest war in American history, ending in 2021 with humiliating images of evacuation, reminding the world that the U.S. had once again been defeated. The Taliban, the same group initially targeted by the invasion, returned to power the very next day after the U.S. withdrawal. Iraq? Another disguised failure. The country plunged into chaos, and the so-called liberation left behind instability, extremism, and hundreds of thousands of deaths. And now, the war in Ukraine. Despite official narratives that the West is standing up to Russian aggression, battlefield signs tell a different story. Military exhaustion, American economic strain, and a Russia, backed by the BRICS, that is resisting and advancing. These defeats reveal something greater. The U.S. has lost the ability to impose its will on the world through military means. The hegemony built after World War II is being challenged, not just on the battlefield, but in the global perception. Because in the end, wars aren't won just with weapons, but with legitimacy, strategy, and internal stability. Three things the American empire no longer possesses. And as defeats pile up, a new power center begins to fill the void left by the US. That's exactly what we'll talk about next. The rise of the BRICS and the transformation of the world order. The rise of the BRICS and the new power center. While the United States accumulates military failures and loses global influence, a new, quiet, and strategic force is rising in parallel: the BRICS. Originally formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group now has over 20 countries interested in joining the coalition and currently represents more than 50% of the world's population. But the impact of the BRICS goes beyond numbers. They are redrawing the global order, creating alternatives to the dollar, promoting development banks independent of the IMF, forging trade alliances, and strengthening energy partnerships. China's leadership in this process is clear: negotiating, investing, and sealing deals in regions the US has long neglected. In practice, this means the axis of global power is shifting. Where once only Washington and its Western allies had influence, there is now a new constellation of emerging powers promoting multipolarity, sovereignty, and joint development. Make no mistake, this rise is not fueled by ideological rhetoric. It is grounded in real infrastructure, technological innovation, economic growth, and growing geostrategic influence. While the US struggles to maintain hegemony through sanctions and tariffs, the BRICS offer investment and cooperation, especially to the global South. This shift places the United States in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Not only is it losing wars, but it is also losing markets, diplomatic influence, and international prestige. The old order is giving way to a new balance of power. And the American elite prefers to pretend it's not happening. But that denial becomes untenable when we look at one sector in particular where this change in leadership has already taken hold: the electric vehicle industry. Electric cars and China's technological victory. The automotive industry is one of the most symbolic sectors of a nation's industrial power. Throughout the 20th century, the United States dominated this market globally. Today, however, that leadership has shifted, and many Americans haven't even noticed. While the West insisted on preserving the gas-powered car model, China made a strategic leap. It invested heavily in battery technology, charging infrastructure, and large-scale electric vehicle production. The result? Companies like BYD, little known outside Asia, have become world leaders in volume, efficiency, and price. What once seemed like a race between Tesla and traditional automakers has turned into a full-speed Chinese overtaking. In Europe, roads are already filled with Chinese cars. In Latin America, they're gaining market share. In the Middle East, they're winning over governments. But in the US, virtually invisible. The reason isn't technical. It's political. A 100% tariff on Chinese vehicles was imposed by Trump and maintained by Biden. The official excuse is to protect jobs. But in practice, what's being protected are the profits of inefficient American companies. General Motors and Ford can't compete with China's quality and production costs. So, the solution was to block the competition. But there's a cost. American consumers pay more for inferior products, and domestic companies that could buy cheaper electric trucks and fleets are forced to operate with less competitiveness. China's leadership in electric vehicles is a symptom of the new world. While the US builds tariff walls, China builds markets. And when innovation is no longer a priority and protectionism becomes official policy, falling behind isn't a possibility. It's inevitable. And where there are tariffs, there is protectionism. That's the next point we need to understand deeply. Tariffs, protectionism, and the consumer deception. When the US, Government imposes a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. The official narrative says it's about protecting jobs. But what's really being protected are inefficient monopolies at the expense of competitiveness and the consumer's wallet. Tariffs are, in essence, taxes on imported goods. A Chinese car that would cost $30,000 ends up costing $60,000 with the tariff. The result? The consumer chooses the more expensive, lower-quality American version, not out of preference, but due to a lack of viable alternatives. Automakers know this. That's why they rushed to the White House to request the tariffs. They didn't want competition. They wanted survival. They wrapped their demands in patriotic rhetoric, using words like jobs and industrial sovereignty. But at the core, they were protecting their profits. And the government complied. But in doing so, it harmed thousands of other companies, from small trucking firms to large manufacturers that need efficient electric vehicles to operate. While their competitors in Europe, Asia, or Latin America buy directly from BYD for $30,000, these American companies pay $40,000 or $50,000 in the name of corporate patriotism. This logic repeats across other sectors: technology, steel, semiconductor. Protectionism disguises itself as national strategy, when in reality, it's a desperate attempt to keep obsolete businesses alive. In the long run, this type of policy breeds stagnation. If companies know they'll be shielded from failure, they won't innovate. And if consumers know they'll pay more for less, consumption and productivity decline. Protectionism is a placebo that weakens the patient. And in a system already on life support, the side effects can be devastating. And speaking of fragile systems, it's time to face one of their darkest faces: zombie corporations. Zombie corporations, companies that survive on debt. In a scenario where innovation is stifled and protectionism reigns, an even more alarming economic phenomenon emerges: zombie corporations. The name may sound dramatic, but it perfectly describes what they are. Companies that are technically dead, kept alive only through debt. They don't generate enough profit to even cover their interest payments. And instead of restructuring or shutting down, they do the unthinkable: take on new debt to pay off the old. It's like taking out a loan to cover your overdraft, only on a multi-billion-dollar scale. This vicious cycle turns the financial system into a credit machine with no sustainability. Banks keep lending, convinced that the government will always bail out those too big to fail. And so, inefficient companies remain in the market, draining resources, stifling competition, and keeping the country trapped in decaying structures. The worst part? While these corporations drag along like corporate undead, smaller businesses, the ones truly innovating, creating jobs, and growing efficiently, get crushed by lack of support or funding. Zombie companies are symptoms of a system that refuses to change. They survive not because they're viable, but because their collapse would expose the fragility of the entire American economy. But it's not just private companies surviving on debt. The largest debtor on the planet is the U.S. government itself. And ironically, those sustaining that debt are its main geopolitical rivals, the billion-dollar debt to China and Japan. While American corporations drown in unpayable debts, the federal government tops the global debt ranking. The United States currently owes over $30 trillion, and a considerable portion of that debt is held by two foreign powers, Japan and China. Today, Japan is the largest individual holder of American debt. China comes right after, with around $850 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. This means that every month, the U.S. government transfers billions of dollars in interest payments to its strategic rivals. Everyday citizens foot the bill without realizing it. Every time you buy a product, pay a tax, fuel your car, or file your taxes, part of that money goes to finance this debt. Money that, instead of improving schools, roads, or hospitals, gets sent to Beijing or Tokyo. This dependence creates a dangerous paradox. The U.S. accuses China of being a threat to its security, while simultaneously funding China's growth with its own tax revenues. Worse yet, while Americans pay to service their debt, China reinvests those resources into infrastructure, technology, and military expansion. In other words, the United States is financially feeding the rise of the very adversary it claims to want to contain. This relationship reveals more than just economic fragility. It shows an empire that can no longer sustain its own structure. And when the economic foundation fails, the weakest link always ends up paying the price. Let's now talk about who actually carries that burden. The working class. Who pays the price of decline? When an empire begins to decline, it doesn't collapse all at once. It restructures, and in that reconfiguration, the costs must be redistributed. But that redistribution is never fair. Historically, the burden always falls on the same people: those with the least power, the lowest income, the least protection. In today's United States, this means the working class is being crushed under the weight of a crisis it didn't create. While failing corporations are rescued with trillion-dollar bailouts and low interest rates, workers face stagnant wages, precarious jobs, and rising inflation. The economic elite, who amassed fortunes during boom times, now shield themselves with tax exemptions, offshore accounts, financial speculation, and political influence. They don't feel the impact of tariffs, budget cuts, debt, or deindustrialization, but the majority do. In rising rent, pricier groceries, and the second job that becomes a necessity. This process is no accident. It's a classic strategy in times of collapse. Preserve the top by sacrificing the base. And to make that work, the population must be sedated with empty promises, culture wars, or political distractions. But there comes a point when the pressure becomes too much to hide. Discontent erupts in the streets, in the voting booths, and in labor movements. And that leads us directly into a critical chapter of this story: the systematic destruction of labor unions, which for decades were the working class's main line of defense. Union destruction and the weakening of workers. For much of the 20th century, labor unions were the main force of resistance for the American working class. They secured rights, raised wages, guaranteed fair working hours, and helped build a strong middle class. But that power has been systematically dismantled. Starting in the 1980s, with the rise of neoliberalism, unions began to be portrayed as enemies of efficiency, obstacles to growth, and hubs of corruption. Political and media campaigns turned the image of unionism into something outdated, dangerous, or pointless. Laws were changed to make strikes harder, limit collective bargaining, and discourage unionization. Companies began hiring specialized consultants to prevent employees from organizing any form of collective resistance. The result is clear. Today, less than 10% of private sector American workers are unionized. That means over 90% are alone, negotiating wages, conditions, and benefits individually, in a structure where the employer always holds more power. Without strong unions, the working class lost its institutional voice. And in times of economic crisis, that's equivalent to disarming the people in the face of an attack. There are signs of pushback. Strikes at Amazon, Starbucks, and other companies show an awakening. But it comes late and faces a structure that has spent decades working to neutralize it. This weakening of resistance has left workers exposed to the worst economic scenarios. And among the phenomena that most directly affect their lives is one of the most perverse mechanisms today: inflation. Inflation, a tool of expropriation. Inflation is often treated as a mysterious, almost natural phenomenon, as if it simply happens. But that view hides an uncomfortable reality. Inflation is also a decision, and in the wrong hands, it becomes a tool for transferring wealth. In recent years, the prices of basic goods have skyrocketed. Rent, energy, food, everything has become more expensive. But what most people don't realize is that wages haven't kept up. When prices rise faster than income, workers lose purchasing power. They work the same, or more, and take home less. That difference, that lost value, doesn't just vanish. It is captured by those with the power to set prices, large corporations. By raising their prices rapidly, they protect and often expand their profits, while consumers are forced to accept or go into debt. The usual excuses are supply chain issues, war, or the pandemic. But, in practice, these are business decisions made in boardrooms based on profit forecasts and market control. They're not natural phenomena. They're deliberate strategies. In these terms, inflation becomes a disguised form of expropriation. It slowly takes from the many and concentrates wealth in the hands of the few, silently. And what does the government do? Instead of intervening in prices or limiting abuse, it resorts to the same old solution, raising interest rates. But as we'll see next, that measure doesn't solve the problem. It only pushes the cost further, downward. The interest rate lie and hidden exploitation. When inflation spikes, the U.S. government's automatic response, encouraged by the Federal Reserve, is to raise interest rates. The official explanation is simple. By making credit more expensive, consumption decreases and prices fall. But that narrative hides a harsh truth. High interest rates are a punishment that hits precisely those already suffering. The average worker feels the impact immediately. Car loans become unaffordable, credit card balances spiral, and the dream of home ownership slips another decade away. And the rich? They're unaffected. Those with accumulated capital, dollar-based investments, or passive income don't rely on credit, and often even profit from higher rates. This inflation-fighting policy hits the people, not the system. Worse, it doesn't address the root causes of inflation, which often lie in speculation, artificial price hikes, and market concentration. On the contrary, it further crushes popular demand, reduces economic growth, and deepens inequality. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, as long as it only burns the homes of the poor. There are alternatives. There were times when the government directly intervened in prices, capped profit margins, and banned abusive hikes. And it worked. But today, those options are ignored, treated as taboo. Why? Because they threaten the real interests behind the system, the profits of big corporations and banks. Raising interest rates is presented as a technical solution, but in practice, it's a political and ideological tool used to protect the top and sacrifice the base. But has it always been this way? Or does the past hold forgotten examples of how to deal with crises more fairly? Historical precedents for price controls. The idea that there is no alternative to high interest rates is a convenient myth for those who profit from inequality. But American history proves that other solutions not only exist, they've already been successfully applied. In 1971, at the peak of inflation driven by Vietnam War spending, President Richard Nixon, a conservative Republican, went on national television and announced a drastic measure: a wage and price freeze. The message was clear: anyone trying to raise prices would be punished. The result? Inflation dropped overnight. It was a temporary policy, yes, but it proved that the government does have the power to act directly, and that when there is political will, inflation can be contained without sacrificing the poor. Another key example came in the 1940s during World War II. Knowing that the war effort would divert resources from consumer goods production, economists, many with socialist leanings, warned President Roosevelt, if the market is left to set prices, essential goods will end up only in the hands of the wealthy. The government's response was coordinated and pragmatic: rationing, price controls, and rent freezes. This prevented an inflationary explosion and ensured access to basic products during the war's most critical period. These episodes show that inflation is not an uncontrollable force of nature. It can, and must, be addressed with political courage and a focus on social welfare. The problem is that today, no one talks about this anymore. What was once seen as a viable solution is now treated as economic heresy, and this historical amnesia is incredibly useful for preserving a system where a minority profits from the majority's suffering. But this twisted logic isn't only present in prices. It's also deeply rooted in U.S. foreign policy and in how it justifies its wars. Hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy. While domestically and economically the United States faces growing contradictions and inequality, abroad, hypocrisy has become its main diplomatic tool. The nation that claims to defend freedom and sovereignty has a long history of interventions, invasions, and support for authoritarian regimes, as long as they serve its interests. The official narrative preaches that major powers shouldn't invade smaller countries. But how do you explain Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama, Grenada, and so many other instances where the U.S. used military force to impose its will? Today, the U.S. condemns Russia for invading Ukraine, and rightfully so, as no invasion is justifiable. But that argument rings hollow, coming from a country that invaded nations under false pretenses, like the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which never existed. The issue isn't just the act, it's the pattern, the moral selectivity, the way the empire decides who gets to break the rules and who should be punished for doing so. This double standard doesn't go unnoticed. Countries in the global south no longer accept this model without challenge. What was once seen as American leadership is now increasingly viewed as imposition, blackmail, or hypocrisy. But no recent case exposes this loss of moral authority more than the war in Ukraine, where the U.S. went all in on a strategy that, by all indications, is failing. The failure of the Ukraine war strategy. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the United States responded forcefully, not with troops, but with economic sanctions, arms shipments, and global political support. The goal was clear: isolate Moscow, collapse its economy, and turn the conflict into a resounding failure for Putin. But after the initial months, reality began to defy expectations. The Russian economy held firm, backed by partnerships with China, India, and other BRICS nations. The ruble didn't turn to rubble, as Biden predicted. On the contrary, Russia saw economic growth while much of Europe faced recession and energy shortages. The American strategy relied on the power of sanctions, but that power isn't what it once was. The world is no longer unipolar, and more countries are seeking alternatives to the dollar and Washington-controlled systems. Alliances are shifting, and reliance on U.S. influence is fading. On the battlefield, things also contradicted early optimism. Ukraine's counteroffensive stalled, Western military support faced growing political resistance, and the American public began questioning why billions were being sent to a distant war while domestic problems worsened. This failure exposes not only the limits of U.S. influence, but also its strategic blindness. The same arrogance that marked past invasions resurfaced here, assuming that political will and moral rhetoric alone could bend the world. But times have changed, and the insistence on repeating failed tactics reveals more than stubbornness. It reveals denial. And when that denial collides with internal desperation, figures like Donald Trump begin to regain ground. Trump as a symptom, not a solution. The rise of Donald Trump is no accident. It's a symptom. He is the direct product of a collapsing system in which the working class feels betrayed, ignored, and abandoned after decades of economic policies that benefited the few and sacrificed the many. For years, both Democrats and Republicans promised prosperity, but delivered precarious jobs, debt, wars, and inequality. In this vacuum of representation, Trump emerged as the different one. He said what others were afraid to say. He broke with political correctness, attacked immigrants, women, and journalists, all in the name of giving the people a voice. But this aggressive rhetoric wasn't accompanied by real solution. His presidency was marked by tax cuts for the rich, empowerment of big corporations, and a deepening of social divisions. Trump knew how to channel despair, but never had any intention or plan to solve it. Still, his message resonates. Because, in the midst of chaos, many believe that any disruption is better than more of the same. Trump represents the rage of the forgotten, even if he doesn't represent their interests. The most tragic part is that there was a legitimate political alternative, one that also captured this sentiment of revolt, but with a more inclusive and progressive agenda. And that alternative was suffocated from within the Democratic Party itself. That's what we'll explore next: Bernie Sanders and the missed opportunity to steer the country in a fairer direction. The missed chance with Bernie Sanders. While Trump capitalized on public anger from the right, Bernie Sanders offered a response from the left, with concrete proposals: universal health care, free public universities, progressive taxes on billionaires, and stronger labor unions. But unlike Trump, who was embraced by his party, Sanders was systematically undermined by the Democratic establishment. Even as one of the most popular candidates among young people, workers, and minorities, his campaign was sabotaged in 2016, and again in 2020. The Democratic primaries became a stage play, where the goal wasn't to listen to the base, but to protect the elite. This choice came at a high cost. The Democratic Party gave up on renewing its identity and instead doubled down on traditional figures like Joe Biden, with moderate speeches and timid solutions. In doing so, it lost the chance to channel the demand for change in a constructive way. Sanders wasn't just a politician. He represented a real possibility of breaking with neoliberalism and restoring trust in institutional politics. His defeat symbolized the elite's fear of change, even when that change was the last opportunity to avoid the radicalization now fueling extremism. And that same fear shapes America's foreign alliances, especially with Israel, in a context of war and growing discredit. Israel, Gaza, and the cost of alignment. The relationship between the United States and Israel is one of the most enduring alliances in modern geopolitics. But in times of imperial decline, even the closest allies become burdens. And the case of Gaza is a clear example. Israel has long been portrayed as a democratic stronghold in the Middle East. However, as its military actions intensify, especially against Palestinian civilians, international pressure and global criticism grow. The invasion of Gaza, meant to weaken Hamas, resulted in mass destruction, human suffering, and near-unanimous condemnation by the international community. The problem for the United States is that its unconditional alliance with Israel makes it complicit in the eyes of the world. When Washington blocks UN resolutions or continues to send weapons despite accusations of war crimes, its moral authority collapses. The consequences go beyond diplomacy. Companies pull away, countries seek new alliances, and popular movements grow stronger against American imperialism, further eroding the U.S.'s global leadership. Israel placed all its bets on American protection. But that bet, which worked for decades, now comes with a steep price. Israel's international image is in ruins, and the U.S. is being dragged down with it. And while that alliance frays, another strategic neighbor is heading toward collapse. Not through war, but through disastrous immigration and economic policy. Mexico. Mexico, immigration, and the coming chaos. As the United States faces global criticism over its ties with Israel, a silent disaster is brewing to the south. The looming collapse of Mexico, driven by incoherent immigration and economic policies. Donald Trump has promised to deport millions of immigrants and raise tariffs on Mexican products. But turning that rhetoric into action could trigger a devastating chain reaction, not just for Mexico, but for the U.S. itself. Millions of Mexican families rely on remittances sent by relatives who live and work in the United States. These remittances are one of Mexico's largest sources of foreign currency. If these people are deported en masse, the Mexican economy will lose billions. At the same time, trade tariffs would hinder exports, such as cars manufactured by American companies on Mexican soil. The result? Mass unemployment, a collapse in domestic consumption, and an even larger wave of desperate migration, exactly what the U.S. claims to want to avoid. This combination turns Mexico into a social and economic powder keg. A country with no alternatives can become fertile ground for organized crime, institutional collapse, and systemic violence, with direct consequences at the U.S. border. In the name of populism, the U.S. is creating the perfect conditions for a regional disaster. And when it finally explodes, it will be too late to contain. As chaos spreads among allies and neighbors, the domestic narrative tries to disguise another inconvenient truth. The U.S. no longer leads the world. The myth of American economic leadership. For decades, the United States was portrayed as the engine of global growth. But that idea, though still repeated by the media and politicians, no longer holds up under scrutiny. Recently, the International Monetary Fund projected a 2.7% growth rate for the U.S. economy, a positive number, but far from indicating leadership. In the same period, China is expected to grow around 5%, and India over 7%. In other words, the U.S. doesn't lead in growth, innovation, or industrial competitiveness. What still sustains the illusion of leadership is the symbolic weight of the dollar and the control of international financial institutions. But even that is being challenged. The BRICS are working to create alternatives to the SWIFT system, new currencies for trade, and development banks independent of the IMF. In the tech sector, China is surpassing the U.S. in areas such as clean energy, electric vehicles, and telecommunications. In education, global rankings show Asian universities rising while American institutions lose ground. And domestically, the U.S. faces a crisis of infrastructure, social polarization, and a decline in social mobility. Still, the rhetoric of American leadership persists. Not because it reflects reality, but because it helps maintain the illusion of control. But every narrative has a limit, and when reality asserts itself, myths collapse. Now that we've exposed the pillars of this decline, it's time to reflect on what it all means, and why acting now is more urgent than ever. Everything we've discussed points to an uncomfortable but undeniable truth. The American empire is in decline, not as theory, but as a historical process already underway. This decline isn't just economic or military, it's moral, institutional, cultural. And the most dangerous part is that most people still live as if nothing is happening. We continue to consume the same promises, repeat the same slogans, place hope in the same parties, while the structure silently crumbles. But denying reality doesn't protect us from it. On the contrary, it makes us more vulnerable to it. The good news is that understanding this collapse is the first step toward action. Awareness is where resistance begins, and from resistance, new possibilities can emerge. This is not about rooting against the United States. It's about rooting for the truth, and for a future that is less unequal, less violent, less manipulated. If this message resonated with you, like the video, share it with someone still trapped in the illusion, and subscribe to the channel for more honest, in-depth, and unfiltered analysis. The decline has already begun, but what comes next can still be decided.